We're going to look today at resentment and a quote from Dr. Gabor Maté, who wrote When the Body Says No, the cost of hidden stress. He says in the book, a therapist once said to me, if you face the choice between feeling guilt and resentment, choose the guilt every time. It's a wisdom I've passed on to many others since. If a refusal saddles you with guilt, while consent leaves resentment in its wake, opt for the guilt. Resentment is soul suicide. Negative thinking allows us to gaze unflinchingly on our own behalf at what does not work. Such a great quote. It's so unusual, isn't it? How what he's saying really, but makes so much sense because so he's saying resentment, soul suicide, and there's that quote as well, isn't there? That resentment is like taking poison and expecting our enemy to die. Really, really, we recognize the toxicity of resentment, and he's even comparing it to shame or guilt, and saying if there's a choice between resentment or guilt, take the guilt, because guilt allows an unflinching gaze on the inner processes, on the inner emotions, on the inner beliefs, on the inner experience, which is ultimately healing. Whereas resentment does the opposite. Resentment holds that view of self in relation to other, and it holds it as unacceptable. This is not, it says this is real, this is how things are, this separate other exists in this way, and then the same mind goes into battle against that appearance, that creation. And because the resentment is holding it in place, because there's so much of our identity, our sense of self, our whole story of what we are really is held in that resentment. It cannot really be questioned. We lose so much of what we think makes us what we are, really. And so the mind lives in this continual exhausting and as Dr. Gabor Maté shows in his book, injurious, really, like a toxic space of stress that results in all sorts of diseases and a shortened lifespan. But it's because there's this unresolvable battle going on. It's the mind is saying it's like this, and the same mind is saying, and it shouldn't be. It's unresolvable battle, sapping energy, creating tension through the whole body. Whereas shame or guilt, on the other hand, which is why it's something that we always look at really in our courses, is a window into the process of how this self idea came about, of what drives its behavior, of where it's vulnerable, of where it feels isolated and separated from others. And because of that, it's a space, a possibility of deep understanding, really, deep understanding, and through that understanding, healing, a healing space. And resentment is the opposite. It's the more resistance and the more resentment there is, the more that reality is fixed in place. So So the stress of that reality, that apparent reality, is fixed into concrete, because the resentment is just continually reinforcing it. So what do we do? What do we do with this? Because there is no doubt that resentment is absolutely toxic to the system, and it's a form of insanity, really, that colors everything, distorts everything. So what do? We begin, as we would everything always, by a look at what's real, a look at where behavior comes from, a look at free will, a look at choice, a look at the impact of conditioning on behavior, and also the impact of conditioning on how behavior is perceived, and a look at what obstructs the authentic expression, what obstructs honesty, truthfulness. So if we break those down into 4 things, so the first is a reference really back to that quote where the example he's given is someone asks us to do something, and we have the choice between doing it and then languishing in that resentment that we did something that we didn't want to do, or the guilt of saying no. And so what's missing there is the ability to speak freely, isn't it? To voice our own inner truth, our own inner yes or no. And the obstruction to that is always going to be what's believed, what looks necessary in order for me to be accepted or loved or successful or worthy, what is required by the world, what is polite, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. All of these things will dictate what's said. And so the expression, the yes or the no, is always coming from whatever has the most priority in that moment. And an exploration of what creates that conditioned idea is an exploration that ultimately shows it not to have the power, the unconscious overriding power that it used to have. Because once it's seen, once it's understood where it came from, well, that's not even always necessary, it loses its grip. It's no longer this underneath dictator. It's just seen as something that was once learned, that was once believed. And now it's seen, there's the possibility of actually turning that unflinching gaze on it and saying, is that actually true? No, because nothing is. And it's lost its grip. So that's the first thing. So from that space of inquiry, there is more and more of an unveiling of an honesty and a truthfulness that means the navigation in the world comes from that place rather than from what are people going to think of me, what if I get ostracized, what if they talk about me behind my back, all of that stuff, less and less interesting. So that's the first thing. Then the second area is that we start seeing that behavior, all our behavior and everyone else's behavior, all behavior is coming from what's believed in that moment. So all behavior is really the only behavior possible given what is believed or understood, because that's the program that's operating. There is no free will. There's a program, there's a conditioned program, and that dictates the behavior, it dictates the words, dictates the actions, it dictates the way of moving around the world, and that's it. And so resentment for other people's behavior makes no sense, because resentment can only come from the idea that that other person had a choice. And this is enormous. To be with this is enormous, because it could be that all our lives we've resented someone's behavior. But when there's an opening here, possibility of seeing all behavior is generated by what's being believed in that moment, what's being learned, what's understood, and that's where it comes from. There is no individual chooser in the brain. It's just the learned processes, really. That's what's happening. And then once we can start to see that for another person, what we can also start to see, the third point, is that the way of perceiving behavior, so our perception of another's behavior, can also only come from what's being believed in that moment, from what's being understood. So it's not that our perception of a behavior is objective or true or right. It's that the perception is dictated by the conditioning, by the learned program. And so we have two really transient variables going on. Someone's behavior that can only be that way, but then the way it's perceived, so the perception in which it exists, is itself a dictate of the program. And this, I think, starts to shift the mind out of that space of judging, resenting, resisting, controlling, categorizing, to seeing that whole thing, seeing the whole thing play out of behavior and perception of behavior. It's massive, really massive. And then the fourth thing, which is so powerful when it comes to resentment, is turning that unflinching gaze on ourselves. So to see that the blame that we had for how someone else has behaved, and that behavior that we find so unacceptable, to turn the gaze in on ourselves and say, what is the equivalent? What do I do, even in relation to the same person, that is exactly the same? And again, so hard to do from the space of an identified mind. But when there's space to watch and see how we're the same. There's no difference. The behavior is the same. The dictate of the programming is the same. And it's why that beautiful Hawaiian method says, whenever you feel resentment, say in your mind, I'm sorry, because I'm sorry for doing the same thing. Forgive me. Thank you. I love you. Just 4 little sentences, but so powerful, because the instant resentment arises, instead of it being allowed to take that toxic hold, it turns the gaze, bam, straight on in here. I'm sorry, forgive me, thank you, I love you. Straight in here. I do this. The thing that I would spend the rest of my life resenting you for, I do it. It's me. We're the same, you and I. And so it seems to me that a conversation about reality and self and other and programming and free will is 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 taking that toxicity away. It is dissolving it because it can't survive under an unflinching gaze. And as it leaves the body, as there becomes ultimately no possibility of even feeling resentment, there's no fertile ground for it to land on. The overall health, the whole health of the system is transformed. Yeah. So number one thing for all of us is to have a look at what's real, have a look at what the self is, what the other is, what's really going on. It opens everything up. So yeah, good. So much love to you. Lots of love. Bye.